Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Rob, I'm dying to find out, if I'm a business leader, why should I care about natural systems?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Jeff. So I think I have two answers to it. One is that for the entire 300,000 year interval of human prehistory and history, they've always impinged on what we do and don't do. And so, if you look at changes in weather on a year-to-year basis, changes in climate over a longer period, we know that those changes influence GDP at a national level. We know they influence almost every company that you can imagine. We know they influence global transport, and some aspects of those changes are relatively predictable. And so I think from a corporate perspective, figuring out those predictable elements and bringing them into management, but then also sort of having a box for what are the unpredictable elements. And it's also true of the biological. We know a lot about the biological future. Even though ecologists like me are quick to emphasize what we don't know, there are many features of what's coming in the next years that we can predict. We know that a lot of our crops are going to feel threats from new pathogens and pests. We know that is going to happen. We know that bananas are going to be in trouble and that's going to have cascading effects for every place bananas grow. And so figuring out what are those things that are knowable from the biological and the earth science perspective that are going to impinge on your business, regardless of what you do, and bring those in, because those are challenges, but also opportunities. But I would say the other piece to me that's intriguing, exciting, I'm not quite sure what the right word is that as we become more digital, we've come to ignore the rest of the world to an ever greater extent. And so if you're the business leader that's paying attention, you've got a competitive advantage. And so I was in a meeting where I was talking about future climate risks, and somebody from the World Bank was there. And this person gave a talk in which she talked about risk in the Sahel and said basically nobody could predict that there was going to be political instability in the Sahel, in the sort of northern region of the non-desert part of Africa. And in my slides that followed her, I had queued up a story about the ways in which climate scientists have predicted that the Sahel was going to see political instability and violence as a function of climate change. We know that it will. And we know that India in the coming years is also going to face some of these same kinds of challenges. And so if you're the company that is anticipating that, you can respond. And whether that response is to get out of the Sahel or to help people in the Sahel think about solutions, we see it coming. Lots of companies aren't seeing it coming. The World Bank wasn't seeing it coming. And so if you can be privy to those futures we already have a window into, I think there's an advantage there. And then there's also an advantage in being able to take seriously what we know and to help people at the right scale. That if I think about the Sahel again, a lot of the solutions for the Sahel are right now, well, let's make a slightly more drought tolerant crop. That is an insufficient response relative to the scale of the challenge. And so if we're really going to take seriously what's coming, we need to be thinking in a way more innovative way. And if you're a company that can think about an innovative solution that's going to work in the future of the Sahel, well, that's the kind of innovation that's going to work anywhere else too. And so I think there are real opportunities there in that mix. And because our digital lives are making us ever more blind to the universe, to earth science, to biology, those business managers and leaders that are not blind to those realities have an advantage.
Rob, that was probably the best 5 minutes I've ever recorded, if only because it is so aligned with my thinking.
Oh, great.
I'm going to tease the future and say that, in my experience, the problem with organizations is that long-term thinking is the next paycheck of the stakeholder. And I look at it through this lens that you're talking about, and I'll put my design thinking terms on it, is that we design at the extreme to improve the mean. And if you think about the Syrian refugee crisis, that was 1 million people. And by some accounts, 1 billion people will be displaced by climate risk alone. Now, is that going to happen by my next paycheck? No. But when it does, it will be existential. and it will be one of those wicked problems that we talk about. And if we don't go back to the core and understand those foundational principles that guide this, we will make decisions that could actually negatively affect the outcome. So before we go any deeper, Rob, I want to just let our audience catch their breath and catch up. Would you just give us a minute and kind of tell folks about your role at the university, what you're studying, and then we'll jump back into the topic.
Sure. I'm an ecologist and evolutionary biologist by training. I'm in the Department of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University. I wear another hat, which is not my hat for today, which is that I'm Senior Vice Provost of University Interdisciplinary Programs, which means I'm trying to help the university think about how do we bring people together across disciplines to solve problems. Because of who I am, I'm invariably doing that with an awareness of the outside world, and so can I sneak in some of my perspective into that role on a good day. But I started off studying tropical insects and working in Bolivia and Costa Rica and trying to make sense of the biology of faraway places. And at some point in my career, I started to realize that same understanding mattered to where people live every day and to our everyday lives. And so that became more of what I do.
Excellent. Well, I want to jump into the first topic, and that was this topic of the Anthropocene and this idea that the problem is us. We are the problem. And so one of the thoughts that came from your book that I want to leverage, and I think this is really important for business leaders to understand, is that humans are probably one of the most mutualistic species, right? We have great interdependencies among ourselves and with our environment or ecosystem, but yet we act like we're apex predators, like we are at the top. And that seems to be a dichotomy. So as an executive, my organization is obviously networked many different places, but yet at the top, I'm expected to rule or act like that apex predator. So this dichotomy, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great framing. And so I'm going to see if I can pause to bite off pieces of it in a non-predatory way. I would say dad humor, but that just excelled into academic humor. Well played. So I think one part of setting the stage here is to think about the scale. And so today in the ecological world, there are literally now more dogs. The weight of dogs, the living mass of dogs now exceeds that of all wild mammals. So I think one of the things we struggle to make sense of is just the weirdness of our time. The weirdness of how much of the living world we've come to encompass. And, the temptation here is to say that we've come to control, although control suggests a level of nuance and
intention,
wisdom and intention.
Yes, thank you.
I don't always see in my day-to-day.
Yeah, let's not give more credit than is due. But so my question is it because the number of dogs are exploding, or is it because our presence has killed off so many wild species? What's the cause of that inflection?
So we have come to control more and more of the living mass of Earth in order to feed ourselves and the species that we're most aware of depending on. And so we're very aware of our relationship to dogs. We love our dogs. It's also a fundamentally weird relationship that we take for granted. Sometimes, like I go to Bluegrass often, and one of my friends at Bluegrass brings a teeny tiny dog that sits in a pouch and is ever present at Bluegrass. And it's lovely, and it's a lovely dog. But it's also fundamentally strange that we have reached this point in our moment. In the last 300,000 years, there was no point at which that would have not seemed just totally unusual.
Like when there's a stroller going down the street and you actually need to pause to see if there's a child or a dog in the stroller.
Yeah. And what meaning do we make of that? Is the dog in that moment becoming a human, and what does that offer us in the future? And I don't know. I asked the question rather than offer the answer there. But those conspicuous species that we know we love, we've made them ever more common, or we know are delicious. And so cows and dogs, right? Cows ever more common, not terribly sustainable in any real sense of the word. Meanwhile, all those species that we depend on, but that are less conspicuous, they're sort of in the interstices now, and those are fragile relationships. And so if you think
goes back, I think, to your book, Irwin's Law, right?
Yeah. In Natural History of the Future, I read about Irwin's Law. It's the idea that there are always far more species than we think that there are, But it's also true that we're always, as humans, we're dependent on far more species than we think we're dependent upon. And so I write some about the International Space Station. And to me, it's the epitome of how we think of ourselves. Like we're floating separate from life on Earth. But the reality is all the food on the space station gets shipped up and the feces gets shipped back. And so the feces is decomposed by microbes or on Earth. And that food is shipped up, but the food is not just the food because, a crop grown to be eaten on the International Space Station also depends on the microbes attached to its roots. It also depends on the microbes in the soil. It depends often on its pollinators. And so there are all these other species that we're pushing farther and farther to the edges and that yet we depend upon. And then if you go back to that timescale issue that you raised, Jeff, those are the species we depend upon today, but they're not the ones we depended upon 1,000 years ago. And they're very unlikely to be the ones we depend on in 1,000 years from now. And so it's a very shallow management of our relationships because we're managing for our most visible dependencies and we're managing for this current moment. And so if I think 1,000 years from now, well, I mean, there are so many other species we might find to be valuable to us, but they're now a tiny part of life on Earth. And so how do we think about those other kinds of relationships? And there's a weirdness to our current moment wherein, because we now affect so much of life on Earth, that if you think about wherever you're living now as a listener, the land that's been conserved is land where humans have essentially given permission to those species to continue. Now, that's a weird framing, but that's the framing we operate in. Like I permit you to continue to exist. And so and so that's a relationship. We've given them permission to exist, and they've given us something that we either don't know about yet or something for the future. But the total area we've allowed for that is teeny. And so this to me is a real tangle.
Yeah, and when you talk about corridors and things like that, like where we have to intentionally build paths for animals to travel, where 1,000 years ago, it's the famous David Foster Wallace comment when one fish says to another, "What's water?" Right? Like we just move, right? No, now you have to move in these paths. I'll be honest, and we were talking about this before we came on air, is just how influential your work was to me. And just a personal journey, I'm looking at my diet and my food and what I'm eating, and I've really boiled it down to first principles in a way. But just as you said, like I know where my DNA was 1,000 years ago, and so I said, well, what was eaten in that location 1,000 years ago? And it was about 2% of what's found in the traditional supermarket. Mm-hmm. So, has my diet been constricted? One perspective, but the other perspective was my diet artificially increased? And why? Well, it was clearly a profit motive that increased my diet. Whereas what's best for me as a species was actually, right, it was taking that away. And so that's the kind of thinking I don't think the average person is capturing. And so give me your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that pivot you make there is really interesting. And that from a dietary perspective, who is choosing your mutualistic relationships? And maybe let me pause and say what a mutualism is from the biologist standpoint. It's a relationship in which two species exist and they both benefit from each other. And historically, that would be their fitness benefits. And so if we're in a mutualism with dogs have more babies if they partner with us, and we have more babies if we partner with them. Today, it's more complicated to say what's a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think read a lot about this in the book. But let's just say, let's put the metrics away for a minute and just say that these partnerships. Well, the species we eat are almost always now in a mutualism with us because we're growing them to eat them. And then to go back to your question about our dietary changes, who is controlling the species with which you are in a mutualism? Right now, it's the food industry has a disproportionate role. Mm-hmm. And so they've gone to great lengths to figure out which things will please your taste buds, which things have a pleasing mouthfeel. And they figured out how to sort of hack your senses as to make a small subset of species appealing to you. And if we look at globally at which crops are becoming more common, it's almost exclusively crops grown to produce sugar or fat. And so that's the food industry sort of running the mutualism between you and food plants and choosing on your behalf in a way to present you with things that have lots of fat and lots of sugar. And then you make a secondary choice. You go to the grocery store and look. But by the time you go to the grocery store, the choice is already framed by how much of the sugar and fat is available. And so if you want to choose something different, you're going to some little margin of the grocery store to do it.
Right.
And so that for me is a really interesting part of this. Who is helping us to make each of these choices?
I think that's really fascinating is that in essence, the food industry has disintermediated us from our natural instincts, which is an incredibly powerful business model. I'm putting, morals aside. It's an incredibly powerful business model to disintermediate that.
Can you open up that word a little bit? That's new to me. Disintermediate.
So in the sense of just getting in the middle of.
Yeah. Okay.
I had to connect. So we have chickens. I take my vegetable scraps. So you give your chickens fiber and they give you protein.
Yep.
In the form of eggs. That's a mutually beneficial relationship. And in that respect, if I go to the grocery store and buy those eggs, who has put themselves between me and that chicken
I see.
that egg?
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful business model. And so I think today there's a huge AI is trying to do that, right? They're trying to disintermediate humans from the value of our work in many other ways, but just if you'd grant me that in this thought experiment. So in that respect, like if I'm a business leader and I have a disintermediated business model, what do I need to do to maintain that? And is that something, if I don't have that business model, is it something that I should be looking for as I go out? Or should I be looking to, again, this is a made up word, but sort of remediate, right? Get out of the way of two things to let them come back together.
Boy, that's an interesting question. So I think one part of it depends on the policy landscape. And so as we reimagine policy, what do we want for ourselves? And I'll give you an example, which is that in your chicken case, which reminds me of the Jim Gaffigan joke about, the great thing about apples is you feed it to a pig and it makes bacon, right? Like there's something pretty miraculous about that. But so, if I think about our current food systems, they're really tailored to our taste receptors, not to our whole sensory perception, but to taste receptors, they're a dumb sense that evolved when we lived in the forest and we needed more sugar, we needed more salt. And your taste receptors are the same as they were 8 million years ago, as in your ancestral taste receptors. And so the simplest model is if you're one of those businesses in the middle is to continue to appeal to the taste receptors.
Right. I mean, you've hacked that system.
You've hacked that system.
It's defensible. And to retrieve from that, you're sacrificing value to your shareholders.
That's right. And so there's the exclusively business part of this, and then there's the business and societally good part of this. And so if I think about where I'd like us to get, one of those opportunities is to figure out how those companies can help us to get to solutions that are more sustainable and healthier. And so Ole Mortensen, who's at the University of Copenhagen and has tried unsuccessfully to retire several times, he's been working to figure out how do we produce vegetable-based foods that are extraordinarily delicious? And how do we produce other sustainable food products that are extraordinarily delicious? And so you can imagine a scenario in which policy landscapes push us more and more towards sustainability. And then if you're that business in the middle, you can use Ule's insights to continue to appeal to our taste receptors and our olfaction, but to do it in a way that aligns with that policy future. And so if I'm thinking about the far future on a finite planet, there are kind of two scenarios with food systems. One is that we get our policy landscape in order, and that policy landscape is pushing us towards sustainability. And the other is that we don't, and we're in way worse trouble environmentally and in terms of, all the sorts of things that will impinge upon businesses one way or another. And so if you're a business, you could kind of think with those two landscapes. And so if you're thinking about a landscape in which there's more policy restriction pushing us towards sustainability solutions, how do you become that intermediary that is continuing to appeal to us, but in ways that also match up with the policy landscape and a societal good? Or if you're thinking the policy landscape doesn't move in that direction, how are you producing super sweet foods that are going to grow in a desert hotter than any we yet know? And so I think you don't have to agree with the future I want to think with the recognition that we're going to still be operating in these fundamental human realities. Our bodies are going to be in the foreseeable future very similar to what they are now. And the biological world is going to have the same constraints that it has now. And so I think that's useful regardless of your perspective on where we should go, would be my argument.
I love that. And I want to take that framing in this, because some policy was thought to be the lever, and now we've had a a clear reversal in terms of accepting environmental goals as policy. So folks who maybe indexed to sustainability, let's say 4 years ago, are now living in a world where without policy, and there are two choices. And those choices are, as you said, either you design food that can thrive in the hottest of deserts, and that takes some investment, and that's not a today return, or you can continue maximizing the status quo, knowing that, or betting that, we talked about risk earlier, betting that I will get mine before the system crumbles.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Well, and again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I deal with this a lot, and I know you see it a lot in your work, especially when you work with leaders from other cultures. So particularly whether it's a family-owned business here in the US or it's a company that's overseas, particularly in Asia, where they have more of a stewardship mindset as opposed to a maximizing mindset. And if you think about it, to go back to your original example, the stewardship mindset is how we coexist with. That's how nature thrives. That's how nature lives. That's how we've gotten to this point, is through that mutualistic stewardship environment. But yet we've taken this apex predator approach where we said, no, I'm going to work on my time. And because I'm at this moment in history, I'm going to profit on a vector that may or may not be sustainable, right? Profitability.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would frame the question of whether there's a third model, and I don't know the answer. And it's a model wherein individuals decide that they want to be on a more sustainable path or a more whatever path. And do they then create a market? And there are those markets. How big do they get? I think we see it with alternate proteins right now where, there is a market, but the market seems relatively saturated. How do we think about that? The other thing I would say, going back to the dry deserts, and we can think about the hot, wet landscapes, like as the Amazon gets hotter than it's been. Anybody who tells you what that ecosystem is going to be like should not be trusted for other things, because we've not seen it before. It is new. And there's a line that's attributed variously, and I'm not going to remember who the right attribution is right now, but the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And so from a business perspective, when the future is already here, can you market to that part of the future that's already here to begin to have part of your business grow into what's coming? And so, variability is part of the future market. Like the very few parts of the US that have not experienced more variable weather. And so how do you sell into that landscape? Are there things that allow people to thrive despite that variability? Well, that's going to grow. Can you be ready for that? In North Carolina, we're going to be hotter in the future. The rainfall predictions are a little uncertain, but probably we're moving toward a landscape where we're going to be able to grow crops that are grown in North Florida. So you can plant avocado here. So, right. So if you there's a version of this. Right now, we're getting enough freezes still that avocado has hard winters here. But if you're willing to shelter a few avocados, you're going to have that local market for avocados in a decade. And so, that's actually a concrete business model for a grower, but it's also a metaphor for how you think about what's happening more generally. Like, what is it that you're planting with your business that is going to grow into the world that we're seeing in the future?
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. This is an amazing conversation. I hope you're only listening to this on one-time speed, because any faster, and I know I would lose track. It's just so deep and rich. I'd want to savor it in that respect. Just some of the things, Rob, that you and I have touched on is this idea of shallow relationships. We're living in shallow relationships, but yet our history is in depth of relationships. And the sustainability of that. And is sustainability of relationships or sustainability of our environment, is that done through, is that a policy stick? Is that sort of a profitability stick in the sense of growing food in the hottest deserts we've ever seen? Or that third leg, which I've taken up myself as this individual approach in terms of food. I'm not going to wait for the government to tell me what the right food is. On the other hand, my healthcare provider is not incentivized to give me the correct food, right? And so the only way forward was individual. And then to your point, the question becomes is how does that scale? And I think that's the $1 billion business question. But leaving that where it is, I wanted to just pick up a thread you had kind of exposed right before the break. And that was this idea of growing into what's coming. You talked about avocado farms in North Carolina, something here in Northern California, the wine region. And as that migrates to is Oregon, Washington, maybe even eastern slopes of the Rockies in Canada and British Columbia become wine region. And should we be speculating on that? So give us a little bit more. Is there an analogy from the natural world or something that you've shared with your colleagues in the business school where how does a current person understand the risk and then design for it?
These are such good questions. So one example would be work by David Tillman and Delphine Sicard. And so they looked at global agricultural yield as a function of how many kinds of crops different countries planted. And the idea that they were bringing into this work was the idea that if you plant more kinds of grasses, more kinds of short plants in a old field, that old field is more likely to thrive even when conditions are changing because some species are going to do well. And so it's very akin to a portfolio effect in managing a stock portfolio. And so what Tillman and Sicard were able to show is that yes, countries that had planted more kinds of crops were better at having a stable agricultural yield when climates were variable. And so I think that's an interesting lesson. And so when we see variability coming, that having a portfolio of things can help us to balance. And so one of the questions is then who has the portfolio? Is that one company that has the portfolio? Is that a local government that has the portfolio? Is it an individual? But the other version of this is, and some Canadian foresters have started to employ this, is that if you're going to plant a forest where you know what you want is trees, and you're not totally sure which tree is going to be the one that does best given the details of the future, you plant a range of trees, all of which are likely to be at least okay, and some of which are going to be better or worse in the future. And so some are going to thrive. And so I think that is probably an apt metaphor for thinking about the Californian coast, is that are grapes going to move? Yeah, almost certainly. Will people find the most drought-tolerant varieties and plant them and as long as they can and water them until the great water wars happen? Yeah, for sure. Will they move north? Almost certainly. But which varieties of grapes do you want to be planting? Well, I think if you've got enough land, you plant a couple and you watch and you have them, the seeds in the bank to be ready for the details of what comes next. And, I think that's a model for growing grapes, but it's also a metaphor.
That's the difference between ecological time and executive time.
Right.
Executive time is I will hire my scientists to choose the right varietal so that I make a riskless investment. Whereas the ecological approach is I plant multiple varietals, not knowing what's underneath the surface and seeing what comes to bear. That's all.
Yeah. And where I would question riskless, like because we measure risk in short time periods, and businesses have historically, if we look at the last 100 years, there have been lots of changes, but the biological and climate changes have been modest compared to what's coming. And so we've calculated the extrinsic risk to our systems based on the last 100 years, which are not appropriate for the next 100. And so if you plant that grape that seems great this year, the risk that it's all going to burn is much higher than it used to be because it's too dry, that grape. And so, one of the things I've learned in thinking at the interface of business and ecology is that when people say, well, what we've always done or what we know works, I'm skeptical. And so when you think about risk environments, if you're thinking about the risk environment from the past, I can't tell you what the risk environment for the future is necessarily, but I can tell you the one from the past is not the one.
It's so funny you say that. I was just, before we got on, I was mentioning Howard Marks as an author to check out. And he literally says the biggest investment mistake you can make is extrapolating the past. But yet as business executives, that's exactly what we do. We extrapolate the past And so as you were saying again, when the pandemic hit, that wasn't in the past, right? That wasn't in the data set. But it wasn't in the executive data set, but it was in the environmental data set.
Yeah. And when the pandemic hit, I gathered disease ecologists that I knew to help think about what universities should be doing. And for disease ecologists, the pandemic was not a surprise.
Yes.
What year it happened was unknowable. But that it happened was like, yeah, we wrote papers 20 years ago. We wrote papers 30 years ago. This was coming. We didn't know when. And so, another pandemic will happen. Gather a bunch of disease ecologists and they will all put all their money. They won't put their money on the year. And what I find really interesting in talking to my colleagues in enterprise risk management is that they did a tally of risks that Fortune 500 companies perceived. And then the year before the pandemic, there was nothing biological, nothing climate, nothing that had to do with the fact that we're on an Earth. And then the pandemic hit, and then pandemic associated things were there for 2 or 3 years. And then the year after that, the list again featured nothing from the extrinsic world. And so I think any company in that landscape that can be aware that extrinsic world is going to assert itself in a way that is not predicted by a linear extrapolation from the past has an advantage. But what I can't tell you, and it's no doubt frustrating and annoying, is that I can't tell you what year you're going to be right. So, but I think managing that risk. The other thing is to look to this broader reality to figure out what are opportunities. And I can give a weird example here, which is
please. This is where if folks have been followed this thread, the least we could do is drop them a few nuggets of opportunity. So please.
So we've worked some on trying to figure out where the microbes in yogurt come from. And this is work by Veronica Sinot, who's at the University of Copenhagen. And Veronica was working with a colleague in Bulgaria who was working on traditional Turkish yogurts. And I'm going to go way into the past and to the side to come back around to the center.
Please.
And the Turkish yogurts were made by using ants, inoculating milk with ants. And so Veronica worked with Sevgi and David Zilber, who used to be at Noma, the restaurant in Copenhagen. And what they found was that the ants were contributing their acid to help coagulate the milk, but also microbes from their mouths, from a little sort of storage closet in their mouths. And that those microbes were essentially making the yogurt. Well, when Veronica looked at those microbes, they're the same microbes we use in sourdough bread, and they're microbes that are not found elsewhere in nature. And then she looked at other ants and found that the natural reservoir for the standard microbes used in sourdough bread and some yogurts and a lot of these fermentations that are economically super successful is in the mouths of ants. And so there's the weirdness of that story, but then there's part two, which is if you want new microbes for that commercial landscape, there are 20,000 species of ants, each of which is likely to have a different microbe that's valuable to that commercial landscape. But you had to have some way to look. And so you had to look to the weird, and you had to have that natural world still there so you could look. And that somehow in my mind relates to the risk because it's sort of the long shot opportunity. Right. I tell you this, I'm telling the story of where we found something that's commercially interesting. And there are 5 other studies where we didn't, but we had to have some way to look at those long shots to get to the one that was less of a long shot to then build that into our future portfolio. And it's like the long shot opportunity landscape to me is the direct corollary of the risk landscape. And how do you as a company alter your perception of the risk landscape to accommodate what we know, but also update your sense of the opportunity landscape to accommodate what we know. And there's a lot of upside there. And because it's invisible, if you spend all your time in Zoom meetings, that not many companies will take advantage.
The famous advice that we give our students is to get out of the classroom if you want to learn. And in effect, most companies insulate themselves deeper into their boardrooms, Zoom calls, right? These antiseptic environments, whereas if we get out into the world, there's so much more opportunity. And as we say, if you design at the extreme, and it's not one-off designs at the extreme, it's building that portfolio at the extreme.
Yeah.
Small, these are not bet the company investments. They're small targets, right? A researcher down this avenue does not risk a department. But if you set up an environment where you create that, to use a business term, you're creating a platform for curiosity, a platform for exploration. And so that if I am a yogurt company, I can approach this platform of exploration and say, what's the upside to, and what's the risk? What's the downside of taking these? And to have that mentor, if you will. And as a university professor, I think I'm a little bit biased, but I think we're great platforms. So let's go. Tell us a little bit about the upcoming book.
Yeah, it's called the Honeyguide, and it's the title comes from an ancient human relationship that may well be hundreds of thousands of years old, in which there's a bird called the honeyguide that eats wax. This is it sounds like a fable. It's a true story. And the honeyguide subsists primarily on wax, but it can't get into beehives. It has no way to get to the wax. And so it's evolved the ability to go to human villages and to make a specific call and a specific flight that independently different groups of humans have learned means follow me, you dope, and I will show you where a beehive is so you can hack into it and just leave me some wax. And so dozens of different human societies figured out this relationship, and you relied on the honeyguide to find beehives, to get honey, which for most of human history was the sweetest thing on earth. And so this was a mutualism. And it turns out that there are many mutualisms like this, that the past is far more unusual than we tend to think. But to me, it's also emblematic because the honeyguide is calling to the humans. It's saying, partner with me and I will show you sweetness. And so what the book does is to consider sort of our history of different partnerships, but with as a backdrop, the reality that the rest of the living world continues to call to us, and we make choices about which species to partner with, but somebody has to be listening. And so if the root fungus calls to us and says, come to partner with me, and we will imagine a better agricultural system, somebody needs to be listening. If a microbe that can produce psychedelics calls to us and says, come to me and I will change your mind, somebody has to be listening. And then our ability to listen has changed fundamentally. And so how do we have enough people listening, but also have business leaders and artists and architects and chefs who are working with the listeners, who I think are by and large ecologists, evolutionary biologists, natural historians, to think, what do we want to make? What are the partnerships we want for the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years? And, top of mind for me and like you, Jeff, and thinking about these things is that we spend very little time thinking about the farther future. And yet, as I look around Raleigh, North Carolina, we're building buildings all over that we hope last 200 years. We should want them to last longer, but 200 is a long time. That means that the average inhabitant will be in the building in 2125. And so we're already placing the electrical outlets for 2125. And we've not asked, will we be using electricity? And so as we think about our relationships with these other species, what do we want for 2125? What do we want for 10,000 years from now? And how do we have conversations that are sufficiently creative to craft those futures? And if you'll humor me, I'll tell a quick anecdote, which is that a number of years ago, we did a paper on the future urbanization of the southeastern U.S. And what we predicted based on business as usual growth is a giant city that we dubbed Charlanta emerging sort of from Richmond down past Atlanta and then around. And that's what we've seen in the subsequent years. That's emerging. And I gave a talk about this at some point, and somebody said, well, why is it there? And I thought about it a little bit, and that's where I-85 goes. And so in essence, the cities grow along I-85. And then some students said, well, why is I-85 there? And I'm like, oh, damn it. I don't know. And so I went and looked, and it turns out,
love students. I love our students.
It's wonderful. And so it turns out that's where the rail line was. And then another student said, well, why is the rail line there?
Why was the rail line there?
Oh, please stop. And so I went and looked, and the rail line is there because that was the big north-south Native American footpath pre-colonially. And so, okay, so on its own, that says to me that we're building our biggest city in the Southeast as a function of where it was best to cross the rivers 5,000 years ago on foot. And so there are two options there. One is that those two things happen to coincide. Like the best place to cross a river on foot is also the best place for a giant city. That seems unlikely to me, but I can't rule out the possibility. The other possibility is that we've embarked on the business as usual for that long without really considering actively what future do we want. And that's my suspicion. If that's the case, we have to find ways to be more creative. And so that was the end of the story. And then somebody said, I was with a group and an archaeologist said, well, I mean, you know why that's really there. And I said, no, but can this story just end? Like I felt like I got back to the beginning. And the archaeologist said, well, during the Clovis period, 10,000 years ago, that's where humans tracked the megafauna north and south. And so it wasn't a human footpath. It started as the footpath of mastodons and giant sloths and the species that humans were hunting. And so Charlanta is the place that people would go on foot pursuing megafauna that humans and climate together chased into extinction. And so as I look to the business future, the default is we keep doing that. And that's what got us the Anthropocene. As we keep taking our technology and we build on where we are to get to the next step of what is possible. And if we want a different kind of future, we need to constantly be in conversation with people about what are these other possibilities? What are these other things we can begin to grow that make sense given what is possible? And one of my observations is that my field, we can't do this on our own. Like we are not good at imagining the future as scientists. We just can't. If I confront a bunch of scientists, we get something narrowly different from where we're going already. And so we have to find a way to get the scientists with the artists and the architects and the chefs are the best. But we also have to have the business leaders there, because who's actually putting the money on these solutions? And every so often I'm in a meeting that has all these people together, and it feels like the best thing I can ever be doing. But how do we have more of that?
Amen. The only thing I would add is, why is I-85 along that corridor? Is that at one point it was probably a shoreline, and our current trajectory, it will likely become a shoreline again.
It won't get all the way up there, but yeah, the sentiment is right. Yeah,
yeah. And you will need to be growing oranges in South Carolina and avocados in North Carolina, because Florida will be underwater.
Yep. And because avocados are delicious. And then the question is, and then here I can take this back about 30,000 years, which is that why are avocados delicious? And it looks as though avocados evolved to attract big cats to eat them by convincing cats that they were meat by having the texture of flesh and the fattiness of flesh. And so if you go to avocado orchards in Mexico, they're one of the best places to see jaguars, because the jaguars go and eat the avocados because it tastes like a goodie.
Meat candy for nature.
Meat candy. It's exactly what it is. Can we call this episode Meat Candy, Jeff?
Yes. Done. Rob, an inspirational hour that will change how I think and in some instances reinforce. But as I said at the beginning of the episode, your book is one of the few that has made my reread list. And this conversation shared why. Rob, many books that you're proud of, I'm sure. We will link to them all. But just give us, again, the release, because we're going to be releasing this the week of August 25th when your book comes out.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And so, again, anything else you'd like to add about that, or other books in your collection that people should check out based on what we talked about?
We talked a little bit about food and flavor, and I wrote with Monica Sanchez, who also happens to be my wife, a book called Delicious on the evolution of flavor, and it's in relationship to these ideas too. And this has been such a joy, Jeff. It's great to think with you, and looking forward to more conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. All right, thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff.